My name is Tommy Boudreau, and I've been working the Gulf waters off Louisiana for about 8 months now. Before you ask why I'm telling you this, let me say that I'm not looking for sympathy or trying to scare anyone. I'm writing this because someone needs to know the rules. Someone needs to understand what's really out there in the deep water, 40 to 60 miles from shore, where the tourist boats don't go and the weekend fishermen never venture. I grew up inland, up near Lafayette, where my daddy ran a small shrimp farm until the waters got too poisoned and the crops started dying off. The ponds that had been in our family for 3 generations turned black one summer, and everything in them died within a week. The agricultural extension agent said it was runoff from the chemical plants upriver, but there wasn't much we could do about it. When Daddy lost everything, the farm, the equipment, even our house when the bank came calling, I figured the Gulf itself might treat me better than the land had treated him. Seemed logical at the time. I had some experience on the water, worked a charter boat out of Cameron for a few months before Hurricane Laura wiped it off the map, and I knew enough about engines and rigging to be useful. The Gulf Maiden was hiring, and Captain Roy Thibodeau was willing to take on someone green if they worked hard and kept their mouth shut. The pay was decent, better than anything I could find on land, and after watching Daddy waste away in that hospital bed, worrying about money and insurance and bills he couldn't pay, I wanted work that would keep me busy enough not to think too much. The Gulf Maiden is a 65-foot commercial fishing vessel, nothing fancy but built solid. She's been working these waters for 20 years, and Captain Roy's been her master for most of that time. The boat's got character, scratches and dents that tell stories, equipment that's been repaired so many times it barely resembles what it started as, and a diesel engine that sounds like it's dying but somehow keeps running day after day. The crew is small, just 5 of us total when we're fully staffed. There's Roy, of course, weathered and tough as boat leather, with hands like old rope and eyes that have seen more than they should. He speaks with that thick Cajun accent that gets heavier when he's angry or tired, and he's got a way of looking at you that makes you feel like he's reading your thoughts. His nephew, Danny Arsenault, works as first mate, been on the boat 15 years and knows every bolt and board. Danny's quieter than his uncle, but sharp as a tack when it comes to navigation and weather. He can look at the sky and tell you what it's going to do 6 hours before the radio weather gets around to it. Eddie Fontenot handled deck work when I started. He was quiet as a church mouse, but good at his job, with a kind of economy of movement that comes from doing the same tasks thousands of times. Eddie had worked shrimp boats before coming to the Maiden, and he knew how to splice line and mend nets and gut fish faster than anyone I'd ever seen. But he was superstitious in a way that went beyond the normal fisherman's habits. He wore a rosary around his neck and another around his wrist, and he'd cross himself every time we passed certain coordinates that he never bothered to explain. Big Jim Hebert keeps the engines running and the electronics working, though he's got some strange ideas about what working means out here. Jim's been around boats longer than anyone, started as a teenager working the oil rigs before the accidents and the lawsuits made him look for safer work. He's got scars on his hands from hot metal and chemical burns, and he knows more about diesel engines than most mechanics learn in a lifetime. But he's also got theories about the Gulf that most people would call crazy. Theories that made more sense the longer I worked these waters. We run 5-day trips, heading out Sunday night and coming back Friday morning. Red snapper, grouper, amberjack, whatever else the Gulf wants to give us. Sometimes we target specific species if the market was paying well. But mostly we just worked the grounds and took what came up. It's hard work, honest work, the kind that leaves you so tired at the end of the day that you fall asleep before your head hits the pillow. The money's decent if you don't mind being bone-tired and smelling like fish guts for half your life. And there's something satisfying about bringing in a good catch, about working with your hands and seeing the results of your labor. But right from my first trip, I noticed something was off. The crew followed rules that made no sense, not safety regulations or Coast Guard requirements. I knew those from my brief stint on the charter boat. These were different, unspoken things that everyone seemed to understand except me. Traditions that had the weight of law even though nobody could explain where they came from. Like how all fishing stopped at 3 o'clock. Didn't matter if it was day or night, if the fish were biting like crazy, or if we'd had a slow day and needed every fish we could get. When someone's watch hit that hour, everything got pulled up and secured until 4 o'clock passed. Lines came in, engines went to idle, and everyone found something to do that didn't involve putting anything in the water. The first time it happened, I was hauling in a line that had 3 nice red snappers on it, fish that would have brought good money at the dock. "Leave it," Danny called out when he saw me working the line. "But there's fish on here." "Leave it." I looked around for support, but Eddie was already securing his gear and Big Jim was walking away from the stern. Only Roy remained, watching me with those deep-set eyes. "But why?" I asked. "The fish don't care what time it is." Roy walked over to where I was standing and put his hand on the line I was holding. "Fish ain't the only things in the water, Tommy, and some things are more active at certain times than others." "What kind of things?" "The kind you don't want to meet." He helped me secure the line, fish and all, and we waited out the hour in silence. When 4 came, we went back to fishing like nothing had happened. The snappers were still there, but they seemed different somehow, more agitated. And when we brought them up, they all had tiny bite marks on their fins, like something small had been testing them. There were other rules, too, rules that revealed themselves gradually as I worked more trips and paid closer attention to how the crew behaved. If you saw lights moving under the water in formation, not the random scatter of bioluminescence, but organized patterns that moved with purpose, you cut the engines immediately and let the boat drift until they passed. Never respond to voices calling from the water, even if they sounded like people you knew, even if they were calling your name or asking for help. The crew had a story about a fisherman from Dulac who heard his dead wife calling to him one foggy night and went overboard trying to reach her. They found his body 3 days later, drifted up against a drilling platform 20 miles away. If you caught fish that were completely white, not albino with pink eyes and transparent skin, but pure, clean white like fresh snow, you threw them back immediately. No questions asked. Eddie told me once that white fish were messengers, scouts for things that live deeper than any normal fish could survive. "They're checking to see if we belong here," he said. "Long as we throw them back respectful like, They report that we're no threat. Keep one, and you're telling them you don't understand the rules. When the water turned black as oil but still reflected light normally, you headed for shore immediately, no matter what kind of catch you were missing or how much money it might cost. That particular rule scared me more than the others because I'd seen water like that before, back when Daddy's shrimp ponds started dying. But on the Gulf, the black water moved with purpose, flowing in currents that didn't match the wind or tides. Never looked directly at anything that surfaced between sunset and full dark. This was the rule that confused me most, because things surface in the Gulf all the time. Dolphins, sea turtles, logs, debris from storms or ships. But the crew would get nervous as evening approached, and everyone would find excuses to be below deck or facing away from the water during the transition from day to night. If something did surface during that time, they'd track it in their peripheral vision, but never turn their heads to look at it straight on. The music rule was the strangest of all. If you heard music coming from below deck when everyone was accounted for, melodies drifting up from the galley or the engine room or the sleeping quarters, you didn't investigate. You didn't go looking for radios that might have turned on by themselves or electronics that might be malfunctioning. You just ignored it, no matter how beautiful or haunting the music might be, no matter how much it made you want to find its source. When I pressed for explanations, Big Jim would just grunt and turn back to his engines. Eddie would make the sign of the cross and change the subject. Danny would give me that look like I was asking why water was wet or why the sun came up in the east. Only Captain Roy would talk, and even then, not much. "Some things out here don't want to be understood, Tommy," he told me one evening as we watched the sunset paint the water red. We were maybe 50 miles out, far enough that the lights from shore were just a faint glow on the horizon, and the water stretched away in all directions like we were the only people left in the world. Just respect it, follow the rules, and you come home to your family. Break them. He shrugged, but there was weight behind the gesture. Well, we've lost good men who thought they knew better. I should have asked how many. I should have asked their names, asked what had happened to them, asked why Roy kept fishing waters that had killed his friends. Instead, I just nodded and went back to coiling rope, telling myself these were just old fishermen's superstitions. Harmless traditions passed down from fathers to sons, no different from not whistling on deck or painting eyes on the bow to help the boat see where it was going. I was wrong about that too. The first time I really understood that something was wrong, really wrong, not just old-fashioned superstition, but genuinely dangerous, came during my third trip out. We'd had a good day, holes nearly full, everyone in decent spirits despite the October heat that made the deck plates too hot to touch with bare skin. The fishing had been steady, nothing spectacular but consistent, and we were looking at a decent payday when we got back to port. I was working the late shift, bringing in night lines while the rest of the crew slept. It was peaceful work, just me and the stars and the gentle rocking of the boat. The water was calm, barely a ripple except for our wake, and I was enjoying the solitude after days of constant noise and activity. Night fishing was different from day fishing, quieter, more contemplative, with just the soft splash of the lines and the distant hum of the generator to break the silence. That's when I hooked something. that fought like nothing I'd ever felt. The fish came up easy at first, no heavier than a normal red snapper, and I was already thinking about how to log it in the catch book. But when it hit the surface and started thrashing, I knew something was wrong. The fight was different, not the desperate struggle of a fish trying to escape, but something more controlled, more purposeful, like it was testing the line, learning about the equipment, figuring out how much force it would take to break free. Even in the deck lights, I could see it was big. Maybe 20 pounds of red snapper, which was a good fish, but not unprecedented. But when it cleared the water completely, and I got my first clear look at it, my blood went cold. The fish was white, not pale, not sick-looking, but white as fresh paper or new snow. Its scales caught the light and threw it back like mirrors, creating patterns that shifted and danced as the fish moved. The fins were translucent white, almost glowing, and when I got it close enough to the boat, I saw that its eyes were the same clean white as the rest of it. No pupils, no iris, no black dot in the center, just white that seemed to have depth to it, like looking into fog or milk. I hesitated. Thing was beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl. Beautiful and terrible and completely wrong. But it was also valuable. That was more red snapper than I usually saw in a week, and a fish that size would bring good money at the dock. My hand was on the gaff, ready to bring it aboard, when the fish opened its mouth. The sound that came out wasn't anything a fish should make. It was high and thin and mournful, like a child crying for its mother or a woman keening for the dead. The white eyes fixed on mine with an intelligence that no fish should possess. And I swear I saw something like recognition there, something that knew exactly what was happening and didn't like it one bit. Sweet Mary and Joseph, Eddie's voice came from right behind me, making me jump. I hadn't heard him approach, over the sound of the generators and the fishes crying. Tommy, throw it back, right now. But it's right now. He grabbed the line above my hands and started hauling it higher, away from the boat. Don't let it touch the deck. I was so startled by his urgency that I almost dropped my knife. Eddie, what the hell? The fish made that crying sound again, longer this time, more complex. It almost sounded like language, like it was trying to communicate something important. And something answered from the water around us. Then something else. Within seconds, the dark water was alive with splashing, and I could see white shapes jumping in the distance, dozens of them, moving in perfect unison like a school of dolphins, but wrong, all wrong. The jumping wasn't random. As I watched, frozen in place, the white forms began creating patterns in the water, circles within circles, spirals that expanded and contracted, geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. They moved like they were following choreography, each fish knowing exactly where it was supposed to be and when, creating a display that was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Eddie cursed in French, words I didn't understand, but that sounded like prayers, and cut the line with his deck knife. The white fish disappeared into the darkness with barely a splash, but the jumping continued around us. As I watched, more and more white forms appeared, jumping in a circle around the Gulf Maiden that grew tighter with each passing minute. "Get Captain Roy," Eddie whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Quiet as you can. Don't run, don't shout, just walk normal and get him." I found Roy in the wheelhouse, studying charts by lamplight, plotting our course for the next day's fishing. When I told him what had happened, trying to keep my voice calm and matter-of-fact, his weathered face went grey. "How long since you threw it back?" "Maybe 5 minutes." "And they're still jumping." Eddie appeared in the doorway, breathing hard. "Getting closer, Captain." "And there's more of them. Lot more." Roy pushed past us to the deck without another word. The white fish were jumping in a tighter circle now, maybe 50 yards out, close enough that we could see the patterns on their scales in the deck lights. Their synchronized movements looked like some kind of ritual, and the sound they made when they hit the water had rhythm to it, like drums, like heartbeats, like music. "Everyone stay calm," Roy said quietly, his voice carrying that tone of command that made you listen without questioning. "Danny, kill all the lights except the running lights. Jim, shut down the engines, but keep the generator going minimal power. Nobody move unless I say so, and nobody look directly at the water." Danny stumbled up from below deck, rubbing sleep from his eyes, but he moved fast when he saw the situation. The lights went out one by one until we were standing in near darkness, lit only by the red and green running lights and the faint glow from the wheelhouse. Big Jim appeared from the engine room, took one look at the jumping fish, and nodded grimly like he'd seen this before. We stood in darkness, listening to the splash, splash, splash of the white fish and the low hum of the generator. The jumping went on for maybe 20 minutes, the rhythm never changing, the circle growing tighter until I could hear individual splashes all around the boat. Whatever message the white fish were sending, they were making sure it was heard. The worst part was the waiting, standing there in the dark, knowing something was happening, but not understanding what, feeling like we were surrounded by forces we couldn't comprehend or control. I wanted to ask questions, wanted to know what was going on and what we should do, but the tension in the crew kept me quiet. They'd all been through this before, and their fear was real enough to keep me from doing anything stupid. Gradually, the jumping slowed. One by one, the white forms disappeared beneath the surface until the water was still again. But nobody moved until Roy gave the all clear, and even then, we kept the lights dim for another hour. "What were those things?" I asked when Roy finally turned the deck lights back on. "Scouts," he said simply, checking the lines to make sure they were still secure, making sure you followed the rules. "Scouts for what?" But Roy was already walking away, dismissing the question with a wave of his hand. "Get some sleep, Tommy. We fish early tomorrow." I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I dozed off, I'd hear that crying sound in my dreams, that almost language that the white fish had made when I brought it to the surface. I'd wake up thinking about those white eyes and the intelligence behind them, wondering what they'd been trying to tell me and what would have happened if I'd kept the fish instead of throwing it back. The next few trips passed without major incident, but I started paying closer attention to the rules. I watched how the crew would suddenly stop whatever they were doing when someone called out the time, dropping tools and securing equipment like their lives depended on it. I noticed how Danny would scan the water constantly during certain hours, looking for lights that moved with purpose instead of just drifting with the current. I saw how everyone gave the rail a wide berth after dark, and how they'd all find excuses to be somewhere else when voices carried across the water on foggy nights. I started keeping my own mental catalogue of strange things I saw in the water. Debris that moved against the current, patches of water that were a different color or temperature than their surroundings, schools of fish that moved in formations too perfect to be natural, sounds that carried farther than they should, or came from directions where nothing should be making noise. It was during my 6th trip that I learned why we never looked directly at things that surfaced between sunset and full dark. We'd had a good day fishing, the kind of day that made you remember why you chose this work despite all its hardships. The weather had been perfect, the fish cooperative, and we were heading home with holds full enough to make everyone happy. The sun was just touching the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reflected off the water like liquid fire. Danny spotted something breaking the surface about 100 yards off our starboard side. At first, I thought it was a whale. We saw them sometimes in the deep water, usually at a distance, usually heading somewhere else. But this one was closer than usual, and it wasn't moving like any whale I'd ever seen. "Don't look at it," Roy called out immediately, his voice sharp with urgency. "Whatever you do, don't look directly at it." Of course, that just made me want to look more. Human nature, I guess. Tell someone not to do something, and it becomes the only thing they can think about. I could see something out there in my peripheral vision, something big enough to displace a lot of water when it moved. It was dark, darker than the water around it, and it moved in jerky, mechanical motions that didn't match anything natural I'd ever seen. "What is it?" I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed on the horizon, but tracking the thing in my peripheral vision. "Don't know. Don't want to know," Eddie replied, his voice tight with fear. "Long as we don't look at it direct, it'll move along." But I was young and curious and stupid, and when I heard a sound like metal grinding against stone coming from the thing in the water, a sound that set my teeth on edge and made my skin crawl, I turned my head before I could stop myself. What I saw didn't make sense. My brain kept trying to process it as something familiar, a whale, a submarine, a piece of driftwood, some kind of machinery that had fallen off a ship. But it wasn't any of those things. It was long and dark and covered in what looked like oil, but the oil moved on its own, flowing in patterns across the surface like it was alive. Where I expected to see eyes or a mouth or some recognizable feature, there were just more patterns, geometric shapes that shifted and changed as I watched. The shapes weren't random. They formed and dissolved and reformed in sequences that seemed to have meaning, like some kind of visual language I couldn't understand. And the longer I looked, the more complex the patterns became, like whatever was creating them was responding to my attention, trying to communicate something important. The worst part was that when I looked at it, it looked back. I could feel its attention like a physical weight, pressing against my mind, trying to push its way inside my thoughts. The patterns on its surface changed, becoming more urgent, more insistent, and I felt myself leaning forward, wanting to get closer, wanting to understand what it was trying to tell me. Roy grabbed my head and physically turned it away, his calloused hands rough against my skin. "Damn it, Tommy. Jim, give us some speed. Now." The engines roared to life, and the Gulf Maiden lurched forward, throwing spray across the deck as we picked up speed. Behind us, I could hear something large moving through the water. Not the smooth motion of a whale or dolphin, but something that pushed through the waves with mechanical precision. The sound of metal on stone continued, getting louder, until Roy turned up the engines to full power, and we left whatever it was behind in our wake. "What the hell was that?" I asked, when he finally let me go, my heart still hammering in my chest. "Something that's been down there too long," Roy said, checking our wake to make sure we weren't being followed. "Something that's changed." Changed from what? But Roy just shook his head and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers and a lingering sense that I'd seen something I wasn't meant to see, something that had seen me in return and found me interesting. That night, I couldn't shake the memory of those shifting patterns, the sense that something had been trying to communicate with me. I found myself drawing geometric shapes on scrap paper, trying to recreate what I'd seen. But my drawings looked flat and lifeless compared to the reality. Whatever that thing had been, it existed in dimensions I couldn't properly understand or represent. It was Big Jim who finally started talking, maybe because he felt sorry for me, or maybe because he was getting tired of my constant questions. We were having coffee in the galley on a slow morning, the kind of grey, overcast day that made everything seem muted and distant when I brought up the rules again. "You want to know what's really going on out here?" he asked, stirring sugar into his cup with slow, deliberate motions. His hands were scarred from years of working with hot metal and caustic chemicals, and he moved them like they still hurt sometimes. "Yeah, I do. The water's different now, Tommy. Different than it was when I was your age. Different than it was when Roy started fishing. Different than it was when my grandfather worked these waters on a shrimp boat. All the stuff we've been pouring into the Gulf for the last 50 years, chemicals, oil, runoff from the farms upriver, waste from the plants on shore, it's not just sitting down there anymore. It's doing something." He took a sip of coffee and made a face like it tasted bitter. "When I was working the oil rigs, back in the 70s and the 80s, we used to joke about the stuff we dumped overboard, drilling mud, chemical additives, wastewater, whatever we couldn't process or store. The company men said it was all biodegradable, said the Gulf was big enough to handle whatever we threw at it. Hell, we believed them. Ocean's a big place, right?" "What kind of something?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Jim leaned back in his chair, studying me with those deep-set eyes that had seen too much. "You know how they say life finds a way? How animals adapt to new environments, evolve to take advantage of new food sources, or defend against new predators? Well, what do you think happens when you give life 50 years of toxic soup to adapt to?" I didn't like where this was going. "You're saying the rules are about pollution? I'm saying the rules are about survival. There's things down there now that shouldn't exist, Tommy. Things that grew up feeding on industrial waste and crude oil and agricultural runoff and God knows what else. They've been changing generation by generation, getting better at living in water that would kill a normal fish in minutes." He finished his coffee and poured another cup, his movements slow and deliberate, like everything he did. "The whitefish, they're just the scouts, like Roy said. Mostly harmless if you don't provoke them, but they're connected to everything else down there. They report back to bigger things, things that hunt in packs and think enough to set traps. The lights under the water. That's them talking to each other, coordinating hunts, sharing information about what they've found up here in the shallow water. And the voices calling from the water, they've learned to mimic human speech well enough to lure people overboard. Not perfectly. If you listen close, you can tell something's off about the pronunciation or the rhythm. But in the dark, when you're tired and maybe a little homesick, it's easy to mistake them for someone you know. I sat there trying to process what he was telling me, wondering if Big Jim had spent too many years breathing diesel fumes and engine oil, or if he was actually describing something real. That's insane. Is it? You've seen them, Tommy. You've heard them. You felt that thing looking at you the other day when you broke the sunset rule. Tell me what you think they are if they're not what I'm saying. I didn't have a good answer for that. The white fish with their impossible eyes, the coordinated jumping, the thing that had tried to communicate with shifting patterns on its surface. None of it fit with anything I knew about normal marine life. The 3 o'clock rule exists because that's when they're most active, Jim continued. Something about the water temperature and current patterns at that hour, maybe the way chemicals settle and rise in the water column. The black water that still reflects light normal. That's not oil, son. That's them. Millions of them, so small you can't see individuals, but when they swarm together, they can move as one organism. And when the water turns red and glows at night, breeding season, they get aggressive, territorial, protective of their spawning areas. That's when they take people, when they're thinking more like animals and less like the intelligent things they've become. I sat there in the galley, listening to the engine hum and the water slapping against the hull, trying to wrap my head around what Jim was telling me. How long have you known about this? Long enough. Roy and I have been watching them spread year by year. Used to be you only saw signs of them in the deep water, 60 miles out or more. Now we're seeing them at 40 miles, sometimes less. And they're getting bolder, more curious about what goes on up here in our world. Why don't you report it? Get scientists out here, or the Coast Guard, or the EPA, or somebody. Jim laughed, but there was no humor in it. Report what? That pollution has created new life forms that don't fit into any classification system. You think anyone's going to believe that? You think anyone's going to care as long as the fish keep coming in and the oil keeps flowing and the chemical plants keep running? He had a point. Even if someone did believe such a crazy story, what would they do about it? The things in the deep water weren't exactly threatening commerce or tourism. They stayed mostly out of sight, followed patterns that kept them away from the shipping lanes and the offshore drilling platforms. As long as fishermen knew the rules and followed them, everyone could coexist. Besides, Jim continued, what would we tell them? That we've been dumping industrial waste into the Gulf for decades, and now it's evolved into something that thinks? You think the corporations are going to admit responsibility for that? You think the government agencies that approved all those permits are going to investigate themselves? So we just keep fishing, keep following the rules, and pretending everything's normal. We keep people alive, Tommy. These rules weren't made up by superstitious old fishermen who spent too much time in the sun. They were learned the hard way by men who didn't come home. Every rule exists because someone died breaking it, and every one of us who knows the rules has a responsibility to pass them on. That afternoon, I found myself thinking about my father and his shrimp ponds, about the way the water had turned black and everything in it had died. I'd always assumed it was just chemicals killing off the native species, basic poisoning that left the water sterile and lifeless. But what if it hadn't died? What if it had changed into something else, something that could thrive in toxic water and feed on industrial waste? That night, I lay in my bunk thinking about what Jim had said. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the ravings of an old man who'd spent too many years breathing diesel fumes and salt air. But I'd seen the white fish, heard that crying sound that was almost like language, felt the intelligence behind those blank eyes. I'd watched something impossible surface between sunset and dark, something that had noticed when I looked at it and had tried to communicate through patterns I couldn't understand. Maybe the truth was worse than any superstition. Maybe the Gulf really had taken everything we'd poured into it over the decades and turned it into something new, something that thought and planned and was slowly spreading toward shore. My 8th trip out was when everything went to hell. We'd been having a good week, holds almost full, weather cooperating, everyone getting along well enough despite the cramped quarters and long hours. It was the kind of trip that made you forget about the strange rules and the things lurking in the deep water, the kind that made commercial fishing seem like normal work instead of a constant dance around invisible dangers. Eddie Fontenot disappeared on a Wednesday night, sometime between 2 o'clock and dawn. It happened during my watch, during what should have been the quietest, most peaceful part of the night. The sea was calm, stars clear overhead, everything peaceful in the way that only the deep ocean can be. I was on deck, checking the night lines and enjoying the solitude, listening to the gentle slap of water against the hull and the distant hum of the generator. Eddie was supposed to relieve me at 4 o'clock, but when the hour came and went with no sign of him, I went looking. Eddie was always punctual, always where he was supposed to be when he was supposed to be there. In all the months I'd worked with him, he'd never been late for a watch, never missed a scheduled duty, never done anything that would put extra work on his crewmates. I found his rain gear on deck, arranged in a perfect circle near the stern. Jacket, pants, boots, even his hat and the rosary he always wore around his neck, all laid out like someone had drawn a diagram and placed each piece exactly where it belonged. The arrangement was too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to be the result of wind or waves or any natural force. The weird thing was that everything was bone dry, even though we'd had a squall pass through around midnight that had soaked everything on deck. I remember because I'd taken shelter in the wheelhouse during the worst of it, watching the rain hammer the windows and the lightning illuminate the water in stark black and white. But Eddie's gear looked like it had been sitting in a heated room for hours. "Eddie," I called out, soft at first because I didn't want to wake the others unnecessarily, then louder when silence was the only answer. "Eddie, where are you?" Nothing but the sound of water against the hull and the low hum of the generator. No response from below deck, no movement in the shadows, no sign that anyone else was awake or moving around the boat. I searched the deck systematically, checking every corner and storage locker, every place a man might go to get out of the weather or take care of some task. I looked in the galley, the engine room, the sleeping quarters, even the cramped spaces where we stored equipment and spare parts. Eddie wasn't anywhere to be found. That's when I woke up Danny, then Roy. Within minutes, the whole crew was on deck, searching every inch of the boat with flashlights and work lights. We checked places that were too small for a man to fit, places that were locked and sealed, places that didn't make sense, but that we searched anyway because we were running out of options. Eddie Fontenot had simply vanished, leaving behind only his clothes arranged in a pattern that made no sense to human understanding. "When did you last see him?" Roy asked, his voice tight with concern and something that might have been fear. "Maybe 1:30. He was checking the stern lines, making sure everything was secure after that squall. We talked for a few minutes about the weather, about whether we'd get more rain before dawn." "What did you talk about exactly?" "Nothing important. He mentioned that the water looked strange during the storm, darker than usual. Said he'd seen lights moving below the surface, but I figured it was just lightning reflecting off the waves." Roy and Danny exchanged a look that I didn't like. "What kind of lights?" Danny asked. He didn't say exactly, just that they were moving in formation, like they were organized somehow. "You hear anything after that? Splash, cry for help, anything unusual?" "Nothing." I was forward most of the time, checking the buoy lines and making sure we weren't dragging anchor, but I would have heard if he'd fallen overboard. The water's calm, and sound carries out here. Roy studied the circle of rain gear with a grim expression, crouching down to examine each piece without touching it. "This how you found it? You haven't moved anything?" "Exactly like this. I haven't touched anything except to check if Eddie was maybe sleeping under his jacket or something." Danny crouched down next to his uncle, using his flashlight to illuminate the arrangement. Dry as a bone, but everything else on deck is still wet from that squall. "Eddie wouldn't have taken his gear off in the rain," Jim said, emerging from the engine room where he'd been checking to make sure Eddie wasn't working on some late-night repair. "Man was careful about staying dry, never went anywhere without his rain gear when weather was coming. And he sure as hell wouldn't have arranged it like this," Danny added, gesturing at the perfect circle. "Eddie was neat, but not artistic. This looks like something else arranged it." We searched until dawn, calling Eddie's name, checking and rechecking every part of the boat, even lowering a spotlight into the water to see if we could spot him floating nearby. But there was no trace of Eddie Fontenot except for his clothes, arranged in that impossible circle, dry as desert sand, despite the storm that had passed over us just hours before. Roy made the radio call to the Coast Guard at first light, reporting a missing crew member, giving our position and requesting assistance. Within 2 hours, we had a helicopter overhead and a cutter racing toward our coordinates. The Coast Guard took the situation seriously. They always did when someone went missing at sea, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes when they examined Eddie's gear. "So you're telling me he just disappeared?" the Coast Guard investigator asked, a young officer with regulation haircut and suspicious eyes. "Left his clothes in a perfect circle and vanished." "That's how we found them," Roy replied calmly. Haven't touched anything since Tommy discovered them this morning. And nobody heard anything? No cry for help, no splash, no indication of distress? Nothing. The watch was quiet until we realized Eddie was missing. The investigator made notes, took photographs, questioned each of us separately about the events of the night. He was thorough and professional, but I could tell he thought we were hiding something. The arrangement of Eddie's clothes was too strange, too deliberate to be explained by any normal accident. They questioned me the longest, since I'd been on watch when Eddie disappeared. Did I fall asleep? Had I been drinking? Was there any conflict between crew members? Any reason Eddie might have wanted to leave the boat? I answered honestly, but I could see they weren't satisfied with my responses. How do you explain that a man vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his clothes arranged in a pattern that defied explanation? We spent another day looking for any sign of what had happened. The Coast Guard helicopter making wide circles around our position while divers searched the water beneath us. They found nothing. No body, no debris, no indication that Eddie had ever been in the water. It was like he'd simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only the mystery of his perfectly arranged clothes. The official report listed it as accidental drowning. Man overboard during night watch, the report concluded. Gear washed up on deck and arranged by wind and wave action. These things happen on fishing boats, the investigator explained. People fall overboard, currents carry them away, and sometimes the ocean doesn't give them back. But I knew that wasn't what had happened. Eddie was too experienced to fall overboard on a calm night, and there was no way wind and waves could have arranged his gear in such a perfect pattern. Something had taken him, something that had left his clothes behind as a message or a warning, or maybe just because it didn't need them. When we got back to shore, I expected Roy to replace Eddie and get back to business as usual. The Gulf Maiden needed a full crew to operate efficiently, and there were plenty of experienced fishermen looking for work. Instead, Roy called me into his office above the marina and poured 2 glasses of whiskey even though it was barely noon. "You want to know the truth about what's out there?" he asked, settling into his chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints had been abused by decades of hard work. I nodded, not trusting my voice. After what had happened to Eddie, I wasn't sure I was ready for the truth, but I needed to know. The Gulf waters off Louisiana aren't like anywhere else in the world, Tommy. We've been dumping industrial waste, oil, agricultural runoff, and chemicals into these waters for decades, generations. At first, it just killed things. Fish, coral, whole ecosystems wiped out by pollution and chemical contamination. He took a sip of whiskey and grimaced like it tasted of memories he'd rather forget. But life adapts. It finds a way to survive, even in conditions that should be lethal. What we've got out there now isn't natural anymore, isn't part of any ecosystem that existed before we started poisoning the water. The entities we avoid with our rules, they're not supernatural, they're evolved. Evolved from what? From whatever was down there originally, mixed with whatever we've been pouring in for the last 50 years, adapted to live in water so toxic it would kill anything normal in minutes, fed by industrial waste, changed by chemical exposure, grown into something between animal and living chemical reaction. Roy refilled his glass, his hands steady despite his age. The whitefish you caught that night, they're scout organisms. They test new areas, identify potential food sources or threats, report back to the larger entities through some kind of chemical communication system. The lights under the water that move in formation, that's their version of language, patterns that coordinate hunting behavior and territorial claims, and the voices calling from the water. They've learned to analyze and reproduce human speech patterns well enough to lure prey. Not perfectly. There's always something off about the tone or rhythm that gives them away if you know what to listen for. But in the dark, when you're tired and maybe homesick, it's easy to mistake them for someone you know calling for help. I thought about the stories Eddie had told, about fishermen who'd heard their dead wives or their children calling from the water. Is that what happened to Eddie? Roy was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the marina where fishing boats bobbed at their moorings. Maybe. Or maybe he saw something during that storm. Something that made him curious enough to break one of the rules. The lights moving under the surface. That's usually a sign that they're hunting in coordinated groups. But his clothes were arranged by something that wanted us to know it had taken him. A message, maybe, or a warning. These things have been studying us for years, learning our behavior patterns, figuring out how we think and react. They know that humans communicate through symbols and arrangements, so they left us a symbol we'd understand. The implications of what he was saying hit me like a physical blow. You mean they took Eddie deliberately? As some kind of experiment? I mean they're getting smarter, more curious about us. And that makes them more dangerous than they used to be. Roy finished his whiskey and set the glass down with careful precision. The 3 o'clock rule exists because that's when they're most active, when the water temperature and chemical gradients create optimal conditions for their movement and coordination. The black water that still reflects light normally, that's not oil, son, that's them. Billions of microscopic organisms that can act as a collective consciousness when they swarm together. And when the water glows red at night, reproductive cycle, they become aggressive, territorial, protective of their spawning areas. That's when they're most likely to take people, when their behavior becomes more instinctual and less controlled. I sat there in Roy's office, trying to process what he was telling me, trying to reconcile the mundane reality of filing reports and collecting paychecks with the alien horror lurking in the deep water. Why keep fishing? Why not find work somewhere else, somewhere safer? Because someone has to know the rules, Tommy. Someone has to pass them on to the next generation of fishermen who'll work these waters. These things are spreading, getting bolder, moving into shallower water every year. Someday they're going to reach the coast, and when they do, people need to know how to survive them. So we're like guardians. We're fishermen who've learned to fish in hell, and we teach others to do the same, because that's the only way any of us are going to survive what's coming. That was 6 months ago. I'm still working the Gulf Maiden, still following the rules, still watching the water for signs of things that shouldn't exist. Roy hired a new deckhand to replace Eddie, a kid named Paul Tran from over in Vermilion Parish. Paul's parents came over from Vietnam after the war, and he grew up speaking both English and Vietnamese. which seemed to confuse the entities when they tried to mimic human voices. The first time they called to him from the water, they got the languages mixed up, creating sounds that were obviously wrong, even to someone who'd never heard them before. Paul asked the same questions I used to ask, makes the same mistakes I made, and I find myself saying the same things Roy and the others said to me. Some things out here don't want to be understood, Paul. Just respect it. But even as I say the words, I know they're not entirely true anymore. The things in the deep water do want to be understood. They're studying us just as intently as we're studying them, learning our patterns and behavior, figuring out how to interact with us more effectively. Every trip out, I notice new signs of their presence. The whitefish appear in slightly shallower water than before, sometimes as close as 35 miles from shore. The voices calling from the darkness sound more human, more convincing, with better pronunciation and more natural rhythms. The geometric patterns that appear on the surface during their hunting displays are becoming more complex, more sophisticated, like they're developing a visual language specifically for communicating with us. 3 weeks ago, we encountered something new. We were fishing in about 45 miles of water when the entire crew started hearing music at the same time. Not the usual melodies that drifted up from below deck, but harmonies that seemed to come from the water itself. Complex orchestral arrangements that rose and fell with the waves, building to crescendos that made the boat's metal fittings vibrate in sympathy. The music wasn't threatening, wasn't the alien sound we'd learned to avoid. Instead, it was hauntingly beautiful, the kind of music that made you think of home and family and all the things you missed when you were 50 miles from shore. Paul was actually crying by the time it stopped, tears streaming down his face as he listened to melodies that seemed to be speaking directly to his soul. "They're learning," Roy said afterward, as we sat in the wheelhouse trying to process what we'd experienced. Learning to communicate in ways that appeal to us instead of just trying to lure us into the water. Is that good or bad? I don't know, but it's definitely new. Last week brought the most disturbing development yet. We were following the 3 o'clock rule, all fishing gear secured and engines at idle, when one of the white fish surfaced next to the boat. Not jumping, not thrashing, just floating calmly beside us like it wanted to have a conversation. The fish was larger than the ones I'd seen before, maybe 30 pounds, with those same mirror white scales and blank eyes. But this one had markings on its sides, geometric patterns that looked almost like writing, symbols that seemed to shift and change as I watched them. And when it opened its mouth, instead of that crying sound I remembered, it made a series of clicks and whistles that sounded almost like language. Paul was the one who noticed it first. "Captain," he said quietly, "that thing's trying to talk to us." We all gathered at the rail, keeping our distance, but watching as the white fish floated patiently beside the boat. The patterns on its sides were definitely changing, flowing from one configuration to another in sequences that seemed deliberate and meaningful. And the sounds it made were clearly organized, with rhythm and repetition that suggested complex communication. "What do you think it wants?" I asked. "I think it wants to learn," Roy replied. "And I think it's teaching us at the same time." The fish stayed with us for the entire hour, floating beside the boat and making its clicking, whistling sounds. When 4 came and we resumed fishing, it disappeared as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving us with more questions than answers about what we'd witnessed. That night, Paul made a disturbing observation. "The patterns on its sides," he said as we ate dinner in the galley. "Some of them looked familiar, like symbols I've seen in books about marine biology, charts showing fish anatomy and behavior patterns." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe they've been studying us longer than we thought. Maybe they've been reading our books, learning our science, figuring out how we understand the world so they can communicate with us more effectively." The implications of that idea kept me awake for hours. If the entities in the deep water had somehow gained access to human knowledge through sunken ships, lost equipment, or methods we couldn't imagine, then they were far more dangerous and far more sophisticated than any of us had realized. 2 days ago brought confirmation of our worst fears. We were working a new area, following a school of red snapper into water we'd never fished before, when we encountered something that changed everything I thought I knew about the rules and the things that lived in the deep water. The water around us suddenly turned black, that oil dark color that meant we should head for shore immediately. But this time, the blackness didn't just surround us. It formed letters, actual letters, spelling out words in English that were clearly visible from the deck of the boat. "Hello." The word appeared in the water next to us. Each letter may be 20 feet across, formed by millions of the microscopic organisms that created the black water effect. The letters held their shape for maybe 30 seconds, then dissolved and reformed into new words. "We want to talk." Roy's face went white. In all his years of following the rules, he'd never seen anything like this. The entities had learned not just to communicate, but to communicate in our language, using our symbols and our methods of written expression. "Please wait." We waited, engines at idle, while more words formed in the water around us. The messages came faster now, the organisms coordinating with increasing efficiency to create clear, readable text. "We have learned much about your kind. You follow good rules. You show respect. We appreciate this." "My God," Danny whispered. "They've been watching us this whole time. You pour poisons into our water. Your kind does this for many years, but you who follow the rules are different. You understand balance." The words dissolved and reformed, the organisms shifting and flowing to create new messages with increasing sophistication. "We have evolved to live with your poisons. They feed us now, make us stronger, but we prefer cooperation to conflict." "What do they want?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if they could hear us or understand spoken language. The water responded immediately, as if they'd been waiting for the question. "We want to expand our territory, move closer to your shores, but we need guides who understand both worlds." More words formed, faster now, like they were excited to finally have a real conversation after years of limited communication. "Those who follow the rules can help us. Teach us more about your kind. Help us find areas where we can live without causing harm to those who respect the water. They want us to help them colonize the shallower water," Roy said, his voice tight with understanding and fear. "In return, We offer protection, better fishing, safe passage through waters where others would be in danger. The offer hung in the water, literally and figuratively. Here were entities that had evolved in response to human pollution, creatures that had adapted to thrive in toxic conditions, offering to form an alliance with the very humans who had created those conditions. We know you have lost crew members. This was before we learned to communicate properly. We regret these incidents. Your Eddie Fontenot is safe. We can arrange a meeting if you wish. My heart stopped. Eddie was alive? How was that possible? We'd seen his clothes, searched for days, mourned his loss. But if these entities were telling the truth, if they had somehow taken him without killing him, do you wish to continue this conversation? We can meet again when you have had time to consider our proposal. Roy looked at each of us in turn, reading our faces, trying to gauge our reactions to this impossible situation. We were being recruited by alien entities, asked to serve as ambassadors between two species that had developed in response to humanity's effect on the environment. "We'll consider it," Roy called out to the water, not sure if they could understand spoken language, but hoping they would recognize the intent behind his words. The water responded immediately. "Good. We will contact you again in 3 days. Follow your normal routes. We will find you." The black water dispersed, returning to its normal blue-green color, leaving us alone on the Gulf with the weight of an impossible decision. We had been offered a chance to form an alliance with entities that might represent the future of life in the Gulf, or we had been recruited by predators who had learned to mimic human communication for their own purposes. That night, none of us slept well. We were supposed to be simple fishermen, working honest jobs and bringing food to market. Instead, we had become intermediaries in a relationship between humanity and something that had evolved from our own mistakes, something that wanted to expand its territory and needed our help to do it safely. "What do you think we should do?" I asked Roy as we watched the sunrise paint the water gold and red. "I think we're going to find out what happened to Eddie," he replied. "And then we're going to have to make a choice that's bigger than any of us signed up for." Yesterday was the meeting day. We followed our normal route, fishing the usual grounds, trying to act like nothing had changed. But all of us were watching the water, waiting for the signs that would indicate our new contacts were ready to resume the conversation. The black water appeared around 2 o'clock, an hour before the usual forbidden time, forming words that were now familiar, but still impossible to accept as real. "Are you ready to meet with us? The meeting will require you to break some of your normal rules, but we guarantee your safety." "What kind of rules?" Roy called out. "You will need to look directly at us when we surface. You will need to enter the water, and you will need to trust that we mean you no harm." Every instinct I'd developed over months of following the rules screamed against what they were asking. Looking directly at things that surfaced, entering the water in areas where these entities were active. These were exactly the behaviors that had gotten people killed in the past. But they had offered to show us Eddie, to prove that their previous takings had been misunderstandings rather than predation. And if we were going to make any kind of informed decision about their proposal, we needed more information than we could get from words formed in the water. One of you will be sufficient for this first meeting. Choose who you trust ought most to speak for your group. The crew looked at me. I was the newest member, the one with the least experience, but also the one who had asked the most questions, pushed the hardest for answers. In a way, this meeting was the logical conclusion of my curiosity about the rules and what lay behind them. "I'll go," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Roy grabbed my arm. "Tommy, you don't have to do this. We can figure out another way." "No, we can't. This is the only way we're going to get real answers." The water shifted, forming new words. "Tommy Boudreau, we know you. You have shown curiosity and respect. You will be welcomed." They knew my name, had known it probably since the first trip I'd made with the crew, had been watching me, learning about me, deciding whether I could be trusted with this kind of contact. "Prepare to enter the water in 10 minutes. We will guide you to the meeting place." I stripped down to swim trunks, put on a life vest, and tried to prepare myself mentally for whatever I was about to experience. The rest of the crew gathered at the rail, ready to pull me out of the water if things went wrong, though we all knew that if the entities wanted to harm me, there would be little they could do to prevent it. "Enter the water now. Swim toward the black area 30 meters from your boat." I went over the side, the warm Gulf water closing over me like a living thing. As I swam toward the indicated area, I could see shapes moving beneath me, not threatening but clearly present, clearly watching. The water itself felt different here, thicker somehow, with a slight electrical sensation that made my skin tingle. When I reached the designated area, something large surfaced beside me. This time, I looked directly at it, fighting every instinct that told me to turn away. What I saw was beautiful and terrible and completely impossible. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but larger, maybe 8 feet tall, with skin that shifted between translucent and opaque, like living glass. Geometric patterns flowed across its surface, not markings, but actual movement within its tissue, like neural activity made visible. Where I expected to see a face, there were clusters of sensory organs that pulsed with soft bioluminescence. When it spoke, the words formed directly in my mind, rather than as sound in the water. "Welcome, Tommy Boudreau. We have wanted to meet you properly." "Where's Eddie?" I asked, surprised that I could speak normally even while treading water next to something that shouldn't exist. "Your friend is safe. He has been learning about us, as we have been learning about him. Would you like to see him?" The entity gestured with appendages that were more like flexible tools than arms, and another shape approached from below. This one was smaller, more familiar, and as it came closer, I realized with shock that it was Eddie Fontenot, but changed. His skin had the same translucent quality as the entities, and geometric patterns flowed beneath its surface like living tattoos. His eyes had changed too, becoming larger and more reflective, better adapted to the dim light of the deep water. But it was definitely Eddie, and when he smiled, it was the same quiet, gentle expression I remembered from the boat. "Hey, Tommy," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the water despite the impossibility of speech underwater. "I know this looks strange, but I'm okay. Better than okay, actually. What happened to you? I saw the lights that night during the storm. They were so beautiful, so organized, that I couldn't help but investigate. When I got close to the water, they invited me. Not forced, invited. And I was curious enough to accept. The entity beside me pulsed with colors that somehow conveyed amusement. Your friend has been an excellent ambassador between our kinds. He has helped us understand your culture, your motivations, your fears. In return, we have shared our knowledge of this environment and our vision for the future. Are you still human? I asked Eddie. I'm still me, he replied, but I'm also more than I was. I can breathe underwater now, see in complete darkness, communicate directly with a collective consciousness that includes all these organisms. And I understand now what they're really offering. What they were offering, Eddie explained, as we floated in the warm Gulf water, surrounded by entities that had evolved from human pollution, was partnership. The chemical contamination that had been pouring into the Gulf for decades had created an entirely new ecosystem, one that could process toxins and convert them into usable energy. But this ecosystem needed room to grow, needed access to new areas where it could establish sustainable colonies. They don't want to harm anyone, Eddie continued. They want to help clean up the mess we've made while creating new habitats that can support both their kind and ours. The fishing could actually get better if we work together. They can guide us to areas where the fish are healthy and plentiful, areas that have been cleaned by their presence. The entity pulsed with agreement. We have learned to value cooperation over competition. Your species created the conditions that allowed our evolution. Now we can work together to manage those conditions in ways that benefit everyone. But people have died, I said. Fishermen have disappeared. That was before we learned proper communication protocols, the entity replied. We were trying to study your kind, to understand your behavior and motivations. Some of our methods were crude. We regret these incidents and are prepared to make amends. Eddie nodded. They've offered to return anyone who wants to come back, though some of us have chosen to stay and continue the work of building bridges between our species. As I floated there, trying to process everything I was seeing and hearing, more entities surfaced around us. Each one was slightly different, some more humanoid, some more aquatic, some that seemed to be living examples of geometric principles made flesh. But all of them pulsed with the same patient intelligence, the same willingness to communicate and cooperate. We have a proposal for your crew, one of them communicated. Work with us to identify safe areas for expansion. Help us understand human shipping patterns, fishing grounds, areas of environmental sensitivity. In return, we offer protection, improved fishing, and access to resources that your species has not yet discovered. What kind of resources? Medical compounds derived from our adapted biology. Methods for processing pollution that your technology cannot handle efficiently. Navigation aids that work in conditions where your instruments fail. The offer was tempting, but it was also terrifying. We would essentially be collaborating with alien entities, entities created by human pollution, but no longer bound by human limitations, to reshape the ecosystem of the Gulf. The consequences could be enormous, affecting not just fishing and shipping, but the entire economy and ecology of the region. Take time to consider. The first entity communicated. We understand that this is a significant decision, but know that change is coming whether you work with us or not. We are expanding our territory naturally, and we will continue to do so. Cooperation simply makes the process safer and more beneficial for everyone involved. How long do we have to decide? There is no deadline, but the longer you wait, the more difficult it becomes to manage the integration smoothly. We prefer gradual change to sudden disruption. Eddie swam closer, his transformed features somehow still recognizably human despite the changes. Tommy, I know this seems impossible. 6 months ago, I would have thought anyone who told me this story was crazy. But I've seen what they can do, what they're willing to share. This isn't invasion or conquest. It's evolution, and we can be part of it if we choose. The meeting ended with plans for another contact in a week's time. I swam back to the Gulf Maiden with my head full of impossible possibilities, trying to figure out how to explain to the crew what I'd experienced and what we were being asked to consider. That night, as we sailed back toward shore, Roy called another meeting in the galley. I told them everything about the entity's appearance, about Eddie's transformation, about the proposal for cooperation and the resources they were offering in return. So they want us to become scouts for an alien colonization effort, Danny summarized. That's one way to look at it, I replied. Another way is that they want us to help manage an environmental transition that's going to happen anyway, in a way that benefits everyone involved. And if we say no, they expand anyway, but without our input or cooperation, which probably means more accidents, more misunderstandings, more people disappearing because they don't know the new rules. Paul, who had been quiet throughout the discussion, finally spoke up. My parents came here as refugees after their country was destroyed by war. They always said that when change is inevitable, you can either help shape it or let it happen to you, but you can't stop it. Big Jim nodded slowly. The Gulf's been changing since I was a boy. Pollution, overfishing, climate change. We've been dealing with environmental shifts for decades. Maybe this is just the next phase. Roy was the last to speak, his weathered face thoughtful in the lamplight. I've been fishing these waters for 30 years, seen them go from rich and clean to polluted and depleted to whatever they are now. Maybe it's time to accept that the Gulf we grew up with is gone and figure out how to work with whatever's taking its place. So we're really considering this. We're considering it, Roy confirmed. But we're also going to be careful. These entities may be offering cooperation, but they're still predators that evolved to survive in conditions that would kill us. We trust them as far as we can understand them, and no further. That was yesterday. Today, we're heading back out for another meeting, this time with the whole crew present. The entities have promised to demonstrate some of their capabilities, to show us what they mean when they talk about improved fishing and environmental cleanup. They've also agreed to let us communicate with more of the humans who have chosen to join them, to get a better understanding of what that transformation involves. I'm writing this while we're still tied up at the dock, before we head out into water that has become stranger and more dangerous and more full of possibility than any of us ever imagined when we first started following the rules. The rules still matter. There's still the difference between life and death out there, but they're changing, evolving along with the entities that inspired them. And soon, we'll have to decide whether we're going to help write the new rules or simply try to survive them. The Gulf remembers everything we've poured into it over the decades, every barrel of oil, every gallon of chemicals, every ton of industrial waste. It's taken all of that poison and turned it into something new, something that thinks and plans and wants to expand its territory. And now, it's offering to work with us instead of simply replacing us. I don't know if we're making the right choice. I don't know if trust between our species is possible, or if cooperation will lead to mutual benefit or mutual destruction. But I know that change is coming whether we participate or not, and I'd rather help shape that change than be swept away by it. Tomorrow, we'll learn more about what the future might hold. Tonight, I'm going to sit here on the dock and look out at the Gulf waters that have become home to things that shouldn't exist, and try to prepare myself for whatever comes next. The water is calm tonight, reflecting the lights from shore like a mirror, but I know that beneath that peaceful surface, millions of entities are moving in patterns we're only beginning to understand, following rules we're only starting to learn, working toward a future that will include all of us or none of us. Either way, someone will be there to remember the rules. Someone will be there to pass them on. Because that's what fishermen do. We adapt, we survive, and we teach the next generation how to work with the water instead of fighting against it. Even when the water fights back,